Okay, so today we're looking at the idea of secession and territorial integrity. And so we need to understand both these terms. Secession refers to the formal withdrawal from a state. So if Western Australians decided they wanted to separate from Australia, from the mainland, they would be trying to secede from Australia, or they would be pursuing secession from Australia. And we can see how that can challenge the state that they're trying to secede from. Secondly, we have territorial integrity. And this refers to maintaining control or authority over your territory. So how well can you control what is happening in your territory? And sometimes there are threats that are internal from forces within your country. They might be terrorists or otherwise. Sometimes there are external threats. So another state might challenge your ability to control your territory. This image really refers to Indonesia pre-2000. So we can see that there are many skulls around, and these are referring to the many groups of people who have tried to challenge Indonesian authority. And the three skulls in the closet refer to Western nations, which have been selling the arms to Indonesia. We see one skull with Australian complicity. So this cartoon is suggesting that Australia was complicit because we helped train the Indonesians and we knew what was happening during this time. And the third skull is labelled New Zealand silence because they kept quiet about the whole issue. So the cartoonist is suggesting that in the past, Indonesia has had skeletons in its closet in terms of how it dealt with challenges to the state. This is just a summary of the different national interest priorities of Indonesia. We can see we're up to the third one, secession and territorial integrity. This cartoon is satirical. It depicts an Indonesian leader, a former president, perhaps the current one, making a joke to a Chinese leader, suggesting that executing 100 people in one day is no big deal. The reason the cartoon has the Indonesian speaking with the Chinese is because both states have had challenges of people within their state trying to secede, trying to challenge the authority of the state. And in the past and in the present, both have been guilty or both have been willing to use hard power, military power, to deal with these threats. So a little bit of context as to why this is a challenge to Indonesia and why perhaps Australia doesn't experience similar secessionist threats. Indonesia has a long history of brutal repression of separatist elements. Suharto did this during most of his reign. And if we have a look at this map, it divides Indonesia up into the different ethno-linguistic groups. So ethno referring to ethnicity and linguistic language. And immediately you can see that there are different colours representing different groups. And this is because Indonesia is a fairly recent construct. It was a state that was put together by sticking together lots of different peoples. So former kingdoms, sultanates, thousands of different clans, including tribal groups, and several former Dutch colonies. And these were all forced together into what became Indonesia after World War II. And this is one of the reasons why Indonesia struggles in a way that Australia doesn't. When we became a state, we were a fairly mono ethno-linguistic nation. We had predominantly Anglo-Saxon, English-Irish background, and most people speaking English, at least those in power, were from that main background. So we haven't had secessionist threats in the same way that Indonesia does. And we can see some of these threats highlighted on this map. Up here in the top left corner we have Banda Aceh, and these are predominantly Islamic, people who want to follow Sharia law, a strict adherence to Islamic law. Down here we have East Timor, which has now formally seceded, separated from Indonesia. It is an independent state. We have the West Papuans over here, a different group again. Interestingly, they're predominantly Protestant Catholic, unlike most of Indonesia, which is predominantly Islamic. We've got another group in the middle here, known as the Moluccas. So this group is also active in trying to separate. And in here we have a territorial challenge. We have two islands just off the coast of Kalimantan, and Indonesia and Malaysia have been fighting over these Ligitan and Sipadan islands. So many threats to Indonesia's territorial integrity. So we have to ask the question, why is it important for Indonesia to prevent secession and maintain its territorial integrity? And this goes back to what the core of the national interest is. For a state to exist, it has to ensure its survival. And to ensure its survival, it has to protect its territory. If it kept getting carved up and kept letting bits of it go, the state would diminish dramatically and it would be losing a great deal of sovereignty. You can imagine if West Australia separated from Australia, being the wealthiest state right now, and then Queensland had great mining success, so it separated and became its own state. That would be a threat to the national interest. So this is why perhaps this is one of the most important, if not the most important national interest that Indonesia has to pursue. If it keeps losing bits of its territory, there isn't much of the state left. As I just mentioned, this can challenge the state's sovereignty, so the idea of its ability to exercise power and control over its territory. There's legitimate fear of a domino effect. So if, given we saw East Timor already secede, what happens if they then let West Papua secede, and then Aceh secedes, and then the Moluccas group are going to want to secede? It gives this impression, this idea that if more groups become activist and violent, they too can achieve their goals. So let's look at just a previous example of this, and this is a pre-2000 example, so you need to be aware that you can't refer to this in any of your answers, but it's important to know, and you can use this to set up context in an essay. So we may have heard of East Timor. East Timor is very close to Australia, just off the coast of Darwin, and it's a former Portuguese colony rather than Dutch. Most of Indonesia is formerly a Dutch colony, and the Portuguese were prominently Catholic as well, unlike mostly Islamic Indonesia. And so what happened is that in the 1970s, Indonesia invaded this territory, took control of it, and in the process killed several 100,000 people, and have repressed the East Timorese people for quite some time. And some people fought back, but for the most part it was a part of Indonesia. In the late 1990s, as Indonesia began to open up, as they began to let go of the old regime, Indonesia allowed the East Timorese people to vote for their future. So the UN came in and supervised an election, and in this election the East Timorese were allowed to decide what to do. Did they want to remain a part of Indonesia, or secede from Indonesia and become an independent state? The result of that referenda was that 78% voted in favour of independence. And Indonesia's response to this is interesting. They didn't invade, they didn't send in the military, but they armed local militia groups on the other side of this island here. So they armed and trained militia groups, so groups not formally associated with the military, to cross the border and cause a great deal of chaos and death. Up to 1,000 people dead in several months. So the event is symptomatic of one way that Indonesia has dealt with threats to its territory. It's used the military, it's used hard power, it's used violence. And this is a good example to see how Indonesia has tried to deal with two other threats. One being the threat of West Papua in the 2000s, and another being a Malaysian-Indonesia disagreement over who owns a series of islands. And we'll now look at how Indonesia has responded to these two examples, and these are both post-2000 examples. Before that, an interesting cartoon. This is from the late 70s, during the heart of the Cold War. The man leaning on the On the fence is Jimmy Carter, the US president, of course fighting communism, fighting the Russians, and he's saying, "We like having tidy neighbours." And the image depicts an Indonesian president scooping the bodies or skeletons of East Timorese people into a bin. Again, this cartoonist is being satirical. He's suggesting that the US and other Western states didn't have a problem. They knew what the Indonesians were doing to East Timor, but they let it go because at the time there was a fear that, well, the excuse given by the Indonesians was that East Timor was a breeding ground for communists, so it was okay for Indonesia to go in and cause havoc because they were eliminating communism. Okay, the first secessionist challenge is West Papua. This is obviously a confronting cartoon. On the left, an Indonesian president, clearly in a powerful position. On the right, we have a West Papuan native, or the image is supposed to symbolise a West Papuan native, clearly being taken advantage of in a less powerful, uncomfortable position. The cartoon says, "No offence intended." Of course, it's ironic because offence is exactly what the Indonesian president or leader is doing to the West Papuans. And the other comment, "Don't take this the wrong way." What other possible way can the West Papuans take this? They're clearly being abused in some way. Here we have a map of West Papua, and I wanted to use this just to highlight some interesting things, including the mines. So Indonesia has some, West Papua has some very significant mines. Also, the nature of the indigenous people. So there are large tracts of indigenous land all over Indonesia, and this is mostly very forested, mountainous area. And you can see some examples of displaced people. So a displaced person is someone who can't be at their home, so they have to move away from their home. Large numbers of people forced away from their home. And this isn't far off Australia's coast, as this map up here shows. This is the top of Cairns, Cape York. West Papua is right here, very short distance. Now would be a good time to hit pause on this video and open up my classes and read this particular article. So the situation we have in West Papua is one where you have West Papuans with some minimal military training, some arms, fighting for their independence. They haven't been able to achieve it politically, so they're trying to keep their fight active. You can call them freedom fighters if you're on their side, you can call them terrorists if you're not on their side, but there's clearly a conflict, an ongoing conflict in West Papua. The Indonesian government's response has been to send in troops. So in 2000 they sent in 25,000 troops to the region to try and hunt down these activist elements, to maintain control, to maintain territorial integrity. The other thing it has done is used Detachment 88. So this was the anti-terrorist group that was formed after the Bali bombings, a group that the US and Australia has helped train and fund. And this has been used to hunt down and kill West Papuan independence leaders. Another thing West Papua has done is loaned Indonesian troops to TNCs, because of course TNCs operate in West Papua. They return an enormous amount of tax revenue to the state and wealth to the state. And so the government has loaned Rio Tinto the use of the military to protect their assets, to protect the mines. Now would be another time for you to read a second short article. So hit pause and open up my classes to open this brief article. So just to summarise, this is a threat to Indonesia's sovereignty. It's a group who want to secede, so we would call it a secessionist challenge. Or we would say the West Papuans are trying to secede from Indonesia. The government's response, predominantly military, predominantly hard power, both internal, in terms of putting troops on the ground to fight West Papuans, but you could also say it relates to foreign policy, because they want to protect these TNCs, And so it relates to foreign policy because they need Indonesia to be seen positively, to be safe for these investments to occur. Okay, we have a different type of challenge to Indonesia's sovereignty, and this is a territorial challenge. So there are two beautiful islands just off the coast of Kalimantan, and we're going to call this the Indonesian Malaysian Island dispute, because these are the two states fighting over control over these two islands. This is one of those islands. This is the Sipadan Island, Sipadan, and this is the second island, Ligitan, Ligitan. Two beautiful islands, but quite small and of no actual or very little economic value. And the two have been arguing over control of these islands for several decades. So that's the name of the island. You can see the spelling just off the coast of Sabah Island in Malaysia. What's interesting is that Indonesia has taken a fairly political, soft power approach to this dispute. So if we remember that the ASEAN Charter, an ASEAN group, is all about peaceful settlements of disputes. In this case, Indonesia is adhering to this peaceful charter. So we know Article 4 states, intra-regional, meaning disputes inside the ASEAN region, so intra-regional disputes shall be settled by peaceful means in accordance with the spirit of the Treaty of Amenity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. So this article of the Charter is saying peaceful means should be used when there are disputes within the region. And that's exactly what Indonesia and Malaysia have done. They've sought a peaceful resolution. Secondly, we have Article 93 of the UN Charter, which tells us that all members are parties to the International Court of Justice, meaning every state which signs the UN Charter, and you must sign the UN Charter to be a member of the UN, must recognise that the International Court of Justice can try cases and then the results are binding. And this is exactly what's happening in this example. Both Malaysia and Indonesia have taken this case, this dispute, to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and they have allowed that court to hear the case and to rule on that case. The result was that in 2002, the ICJ ruled in favour of Malaysian sovereignty, and Indonesia accepted this decision. So those two islands are now Malaysian islands. The way Indonesia chose to settle this challenge to its sovereignty, this challenge to its territory, was peaceful. It was political in the sense that it sought a political body to make that ruling. It could have sent the army in, it could have sent the navy in. You know, it has a huge standing army. Instead, it chose a political, peaceful response. So what types of power have we got happening here? Obviously, the response in West Papua is military, putting 20,000 troops on the ground. So deploying troops is a military power, is a type of military power, and militarization. So developing a group like Detachment 88, using them to fight what they perceive as terrorist threats. So in dealing with West Papua, a military power response. In dealing with the island dispute with Malaysia, very much a political power response. So, looking at and respecting the UN Charter and the ASEAN Charter, taking the case to the ICJ and accepting the results. Different type of response, different use of power to deal with a threat. In terms of the effectiveness of these responses, firstly in West Papua, yes, they have been relatively effective at maintaining sovereignty. West Papua is still a part of Indonesia. It's actually called Irian Jaya to the Indonesians. However, the conflict has not been resolved. There are constantly attacks on the Grasberg mine, and Indonesian and police officers in West Papua. And this conflict has been going back and forward. So West Papuan militia attack Indonesian military, In 2010, the military responded by burning down 12 houses and churches, killing and raping. So these clashes are ongoing and weekly. There are a long list of examples of the two sides constantly fighting. The other thing we need to also remember is that the Indonesian state's response doesn't bode well for its reputation internationally. So there are negative consequences of its hard power approach. In contrast with the Malaysian-Indonesian island dispute, the course of action they took didn't help them maintain territorial integrity, because ultimately the islands were lost. However, this is a case of a loss turning into a win, because yes, they will lose those two islands, and they're two very small islands. However, the benefits of the peaceful resolution of the dispute are important, because number one, Indonesia gets to save face. The fact that it was an independent group, independent court, the ICJ, which heard the case, which arbitrated the case, and Indonesia can almost wipe their hands and say, look, here we didn't lose this territory because of terrorists or a military threat. It was decided fairly and justly. So they saved face. Secondly, they get to be seen in a very positive light. They've used a peaceful political process to achieve this outcome. They've recognised the ICJ's authority. They've legitimised the UN and ASEAN by respecting their charters. They get to be seen very well internationally. Finally, we need to remember that things that states do, or the tools they have for foreign policy, and this is difficult for military power because it would be easy to see their deployment of troops as being internal rather than something to help their foreign policy. So what I would say is that in terms of foreign policy is to helping the state provide a safe place for investment, the deployment of troops help to protect Rio Tinto assets, TNC's assets. It helped them appear as a safe investment option. Secondly, they've used the foreign policy instrument of diplomacy. So their role in the UN, respecting the UN Charter, respecting the ASEAN Charter, adhering to the ICJ's ruling is a form of, or reflects their role in the UN, their cooperative role and positive role in the UN. And that's it. So open up worksheet 2.2 and it should cover questions for this national interest as well as environmental security. If you're looking for additional resources, you can read these two articles which are on minor classes. Alternatively, you can open a whole range of videos, especially about West Papua, at the STC Global Politics website.